From the top of the gable, I should have the yard and the whole front of the house under observation. I didn't care to enter the yard itself. Even if the dogs neither heard nor saw me, the southwest wind, such as it was, would have carried my scent to them. The wall was built of flints and easily climbed, but there was a gap of 2 feet between the top of the wall and the lower edge of the slates, which gave me trouble. A rotten iron gutter ran below the slates, and it was difficult to reach the roof without momentarily putting some weight on this gutter. Eventually, I got up by way of a stout iron bracket and the gable end. I lay on the slates with my head over the coping. I could see right into the living room of the farm. A peaceful and depressing sight. Quive Smith was playing chess with Patachon's small daughter. I was surprised to see him sitting so carelessly before a lighted window with the blind up and all black Dorset outside. But then I understood that, as always, I had underrated him. The clever devil knew that he was safe, with his head nearly touching that of the child across the board. He was teaching her the game. I saw him laugh and shake his head and show her some move she should have made. It was a bitter shock to find him still there. The 11 days had seemed an eternity to me. To him, they were just 11 days. It was even possible, I thought, that he had been enjoying himself. My disappointment turned to fury. It was the first time in the whole of this business that I lost my temper. I lay on the roof, picking up the moss on the stone coping, and cursing Quive Smith, his country, his party, and his boss, in a white-hot silence. I blasted him to hell. Him and his friends and Patachon and their manservants and maidservants. If my thoughts had hit those walls, I should have created a massacre that would have done credit to a plunging Jehovah, called from eternity by the anathemas of 1,000 infuriated priests. It shook me out of my melancholy, that blazing silent orgasm of rage. I didn't stop to think that I had brought all this on myself, nor to consider that if I had actually been transported to that living room, I should have shown a damned silly, punctilious courtesy to the lot of them. I let myself go. I don't remember anything like it since I certainly enjoyed, speechless temper at the age of 7. I was brought back to reality by a fit of shivering. I had sweated with wrath, and the perspiration was cooling in the night air. It's strange that I noticed it, for all my clothes were as permanently wet as those of a seaman in the days of sail. There must be a special virtue in sweat, cooling one spiritually as well as physically. Quive Smith might stay for weeks. I couldn't bear the thought of returning to the borough. I determined to take to open country again. I am not persuading myself of that. I really meant to go on the run, desperate though my chances were. Considering my appearance, to live and move at all would have been 100 times harder than my original escape. Then I was believed to be dead, and nobody was looking for me. Now the police would be on me at the first rumor of my presence. But I wasn't going back. I intended to stalk around the downs, hiding in barns and in gorse, and living, if there were no other food, upon the raw meat of sheep. I could keep Quive Smith under observation until such time as he returned to London, or wherever else his undoubted ability to increase the rottenness in a rotten world should be required. I watched the living room until the child went to bed. Then the Major joined Patachon in front of the fire, and Patachon's wife entered with 2 huge china mugs of cider. All 3 settled down to newspapers. There was nothing more to be learned. I sidled towards the gable end, the weight of my body taken on shoulder and thigh, left hand on the coping, and right hand testing the slates ahead, lest one should be loose. I was concerned, God help me, with the noise of a single slate sliding down the roof into the gutter. A few feet from the end, there was a subsidence beneath me. The slates sagged. I seemed to be floating on a heavy liquid that molded itself to me, suddenly became brittle, and crashed to the floor of the barn. For an instant I swung from the coping, and then that too gave way. 5 feet of stone tile, a solid expanse of slate, and myself roared down onto a pile of iron drinking troughs. It sounded like the collapse of a foundry. I found later that I had reopened the wound in my shoulder and suffered various cuts and bruises, but at the time I was only shaken. I picked myself up from that welter of ironwork and dashed to the open door of the barn. I didn't go through it. Quive Smith had thrown up the window of the living room, and his long legs were already over the sill. My only thought was that he mustn't know I was still in this part of the country. The dogs started barking and jumping against their chains. Patachon opened the front door and stumped over the threshold, flashlight in hand. I retreated into the barn and dived under the drinking troughs. They were ranged side by side, so that there was room for me between any two, and covered by the slates and rubble from the roof. Quive Smith and the farmer entered the barn immediately afterwards. "Damn!" stormed Patachon, observing the damage. "'Tis that beggaring murderer after my cheeses. Over to barn and down to dairy. I knew he was a-stealing of 'em. Over to barn and down to dairy." I don't suppose he had lost an ounce, but farmers always suspect something is being stolen from them. There are so many things to steal. Quive Smith obligingly agreed with me. "Oh, I don't think there was anybody on the roof," he said. "Look at that." I knew what he was pointing at, a broken beam. It hadn't even broken with a crack. It had just given way, like a sponge of wood dust. "Death Watch, Beetle," said the Major. "I met the same thing in the East Riding, by Jove. Tithe Barn it was. Poor chap broke his bloody neck." It didn't ring quite true, but it was a gallant attempt at the right manner. "Rotted," agreed Patachon in a disgusted tone. "Damn un, he's rotted." "Got to happen sometime," answered Quive Smith. "We ought to be thankful no one was hurt." "Been there 300 years, rumbled Patachon, "and he has to come beggaring down on our heads." "Oh well," the Major said cheerfully. "I'll turn to in the morning and give you a hand. Nothing to be done now. Nothing at all." I heard them leave the barn, straining my ears to analyze their two individual treads, making absolutely certain that one of them did not remain behind or return. I heard the front door of the farm shut and bolted, and waited till the faint noises of windows opening and bedroom doors closing had ceased, till the rats began to scutter over the floor of the barn. Then I crawled to the door and out, creeping like a nocturnal caterpillar along the angle between the wall and the filthy courtyard. For what I then did, I have no excuse. I had begun to think as an animal. I was afraid, but a little proud of it. Instinct, saving instinct, had preserved me time and again. I accepted its power complacently, never warning myself that instinct might be deadly wrong. If it were not, the hunted could always escape the hunter, and the carnivores would be extinct as the great saurians. Gone was my disgust with my burrow. Gone my determination to take to open country whatever the difficulties of food and shelter. I didn't think, didn't reason. I was no longer the man who had challenged and nearly beaten all the cunning and loyalty of a first-class power. Living as a beast, I had become as a beast, unable to question emotional stress, unable to distinguish danger in general from a particular source of danger. I could startle a dog fox, move as quietly and sleep as lightly, but the price I paid was to be deprived of ordinary human cunning. I had had a bad fright. I was hurt and shaken. So I went without thinking to safety. Not to the form of safety adapted to the case, but to safety in general. And that meant my burrow. Darkness, rest, freedom from pursuit. I hadn't a thought, any more than I suppose the fox has such a thought, that the earth might mean death. Under the influence of panic when Quive Smith shot me, I had behaved in the same way. But then it was excusable. I didn't know what the devil I was up against. and to seek general safety was as sound as any other move. To seek it now was simply a reflex action. I took, of course, the most beautiful and cunning route. The animal could be trusted to perform that futility to perfection. I went through water and through sheep. I waited in cover to be sure there was no pursuit. I knew finally and definitely that there was no pursuit, that I was alone on the down above my lane. Then I covered the last lap with extreme caution and entered my burrow with attention to every dead leaf and every blade of grass. All the next day I remained underground, congratulating myself on my good fortune. The stench and dirt were revolting, but I endured them with a holy masochism. I persuaded myself that in 3 or 4 days I could open my door and cleanse and dry the den, and Asmodeus would come back, and we could live peacefully until it was safe for me to hang around the ports and get out of the country. My hands were all right again, showing little deformity. The left eye was still queer, but the right was so foul, filmy and bloodshot that the difference between them was no longer remarkable. A shave and a haircut were all I needed, and then I could pass anywhere as a criminal who had just celebrated his release from prison with a 2-day binge. After nightfall, I heard some activity in the lane and sat with my ear to the ventilator. I couldn't translate the noises. There were 2 men, but they did not speak to each other. I expect they whispered, but owing to the curve of the little tunnel, I could not hear so slight a sound. Something heavy was being moved, and once I heard a thud against the door. My thoughts played with the idea of a man-trap, a log perhaps that would fall on my head. They were certainly building something in the runway I had once used. Since I used it no longer, I felt very clever and secure. I told myself that I was disappointed, merely disappointed, for they would wait another week or 2 for the result of their trap, and I should have to stay underground. All the time, as I now see, I was conscious of extreme terror, and my heart was beating as if I had been running for my life. Only by an effort did I stop myself talking aloud. I am very clever, I was saying to myself over and over again. They'll find themselves run-in for murder, I said, if they catch somebody else. And then the terror came up in my throat, for there was silence in the lane, and little bits of earth were falling down my bolt hole into the inner chamber. I lay between the 2 dens, watching the trickle of earth, and listening to the quick strokes of a chopper. A man, as I thought, jumped or fell into the hole, and a wave of rubble rolled down to the bottom. I reached for my knife and waited. He's at my mercy, I said. I can make what terms I like. I was obsessed with the idea of talking, not killing. A reasonable man, I told myself. He'll see sense. He plays chess. There was no further sound, none at all. The man had stuck in the hole or died. I crept up the slope of foul earth and lay on my back, poking an ash pole up the chimney as far as the twist. It didn't meet the body I expected. It met a hard obstruction. I withdrew myself as far as I could, for fear of some trap or explosive, and poked harder. The thing felt solid with a smooth undersurface. I lit a candle and examined it. It was the sawn end of a tree trunk which had been jammed into my hole. I crawled to the door and pushed against it. Nothing moved. Then I felt a sense of panic, with which was mingled relief that the end had come at last. I intended to rush out and let them shoot. A quick death, merited. I took the axe that had hollowed out the sandstone and drove it between the planks of the door. It turned. I ripped off the planks. On the far side of them was an iron plate. It rang hollow except in the center. They had jammed it in place with a balk of timber, the other end of which rested against the opposite bank of the lane. I don't know what happened to me then. When I heard Quive Smith's voice, I was lying on the bag with my head on my arms, pretending to myself that I was thinking things out. I was controlled, but my ears were drumming, and my skin oozing cold sweat. I suppose that if one sits on hysteria long enough and hard enough, one loses consciousness. Something has to give way, and if the mind won't, the body must. Quive Smith was saying, "Can you hear me?" I pulled myself together and sloshed a handful of water over my head. There was no point in keeping silence. He must have heard me battering on the iron. The only thing to do was to answer him and play for time. "Yes," I said. "I can hear you. Are you badly wounded?" Damn him for asking that question then. I should have found it very useful later if I could have persuaded them that I was suffering from a neglected wound and incapable. As it was, I answered the truth. "Nothing much. You hit a whiskey flask with a leather jacket behind it." He muttered something that I could not hear. He was speaking with his mouth close to the ventilation hole. If he jerked his head, the voice was lost. I asked him how he had found me. He explained that he had gone straight from the barn to the lane on the off chance that I had been responsible for the broken roof, and that he might see me returning to my mysterious hiding place. "Simple," he said. "So simple that I was very much afraid that it was what you meant me to do." I told him that I had never attempted to kill him, that I could have done it a dozen times if I had wished. "I supposed so," he replied, "but I counted on you leaving me alone. You would only have exchanged me for the police, and it was obviously wiser to persuade me that you had gone. You did, as a matter of fact." His voice had a weary harshness. He must have been in fear of his life all the time that he was at the farm. A braver man and a cleverer man than I am, but without... I was going to write ethics, but God knows what right I have to claim any. I have neither cruelty nor ambition, I think, but that is the only difference between Quive Smith and myself. "Couldn't you give me a cleaner death than this?" I asked. "My dear fellow, I don't want you to die at all," he said. "Not now. I'm so glad you had the sense not to break out while I was sealing you up. This position has taken me by surprise as well as you. I can't promise you anything, but your death seems wholly unnecessary." "The only alternative is the zoo," I answered. He laughed at this for a nervous, uncontrollable moment. Lord, he must have been relieved to know where I was. "Nothing so drastic," he said. "I'm afraid you wouldn't survive in captivity. No, if they take my advice, I shall be ordered to return you to your position and friends." "On what condition?" "Trifling, but we needn't go into that yet. Now, how are you off for food?" "Reasonably well, thank you. No little delicacies I can bring you from the farm?" I nearly lost my temper at this. The man's voice had just the right touch of concern. There was but the tiniest shade of irony to tell me that he was thoroughly enjoying his own acting. He would have brought me anything I asked, I have no doubt. For the cat-and-mouse act to be subtle enough to please his taste, it had to be hardly distinguishable from genuine kindness. "I think not," I answered. "All right, but there's no need for you to suffer any more." "Look here," I said. "You won't get any more out of me than your police did, and you can't stay here indefinitely. So why not get it over?" "I can stay here for months," he answered quietly. "Months, you understand. I and my friend are going to study the habits and diet of the badger. The large piece of timber which is holding your door is for us to sit on. The bush placed in front of your door is a hide for the camera, and there will shortly be a camera in it. I'm afraid all these preparations are wasted since nobody ever comes into the lane. But if anyone should, well, all he will see is my friend, or myself, engaged in the harmless study of the life of the badger. We might even get a nice young man with a microphone and have him tell the children what Bertie the Brock keeps under his tail. I called him a damned fool and told him that the whole countryside would be consumed with curiosity, that all their doings would be public property in 24 hours. I doubt it, he answered. Nobody at the farm pays any attention to my innocent rambles. Sometimes I go out with a gun, sometimes not. Sometimes on foot, sometimes in the car. Why should they guess I am always in this lane? They have never seen you. They won't see me. As for my assistant, he has no connection with me at all. He is staying in Chiddick, and his landlady thinks he is a night watchman at Bridport. He isn't as careful in making his way here as I should like. But we can't expect a paid agent to have our experience, can we, my dear fellow? This dear fellow of his infuriated me. I'm ashamed to remember that I rammed my axe against the door in anger. How about that? I asked. It makes surprisingly little noise, he said coolly. It did, even in my closed space. He explained that there were felt and plywood over the iron. And if you think it out, he added, what would happen if anyone did hear you? That disagreeable peasant who owns the field over your head, for example. You would compel me to remove the pair of you, and to arrange the bodies to show murder and suicide. It was true enough. So true, at any rate, that there was little object in pointing out that he couldn't get at me without running a grave risk himself. He held the only firearm, and all the cards. He could foresee a more or less satisfactory outcome if he killed me. But if I killed him, I could foresee nothing but murder on my conscience, and death or disgrace eventually at the hands of the service to which he belonged. Psychologically, I was at his mercy. My mind cowered. We must stop talking now, he said. No conversation in daylight will be our rule. I shall be on duty from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m., and we shall talk during the last couple of hours. My assistant will be on duty the rest of the time. Now, let me make the position perfectly clear. I cannot, I expect, prevent you forcing your way out over the top of the door. But if you do, you'll be shot before you can shoot, and closed up again in your cozy home. Your back door is very thoroughly blocked, and if we hear you working, we shall cut off your air. So be careful, my dear fellow, and don't lose heart. Quite calm, that's the watchword. Your release is certain. I sat for hours with my ear to the ventilator. I didn't expect to learn anything, but hearing was the only one of my senses which could keep in touch with my captors. So long as I heard them, I had the illusion that I was not wholly defenseless, that I was planning, gathering data for an escape. I heard the twittering of birds at dawn. I heard a crackle as Quive Smith adjusted or trimmed the screen of dead thorn outside my door. Then I heard the low mutter of voices, which I translated as the sound of Quive Smith's colleague, taking over the watch from him. They couldn't, of course, keep to their schedule on that first day. The Major had presumably to telegraph a report. The new man sat quite still. I imagined his figure as a silhouette thrown against the darkness of the door. I had only seen him at a distance. I thought of him as dark and thick, as a contrast to Quive Smith, who was fair and tall. I was quite wrong.